Gotham is a city that learned to survive by narrowing its moral vision. Its skyline rises like a barricade rather than a promise, each tower a reminder that order here is enforced, not cultivated. The rules are clear and unspoken. Violence is tolerated as long as it remains predictable. Crime is accepted as long as it stays within its assigned territory. Justice, in this environment, is not a principle. It is a performance, a ritual repeated nightly beneath a spotlight that favors symbols over outcomes. Before the crisis ever announces itself, the system already knows what it will sacrifice. Gotham has always relied on figures who absorb chaos, so the city does not have to examine itself. Masks are not disguises here. They are containers. They hold the weight of fear, rage, and unresolved guilt that the city refuses to carry openly. In this economy of symbols, children appear only as background noise, as silhouettes at the edges of alleyways, as statistics folded into crime reports. They are never meant to become central figures. Batman emerges as the most refined expression of this logic. He is not simply a vigilante. He is a structure, a moving wall built from discipline, restraint, and an uncompromising refusal to cross certain lines. His presence stabilizes Gotham by transforming violence into spectacle and trauma into order. The city reads him as proof that morality can be enforced without surrendering to cruelty. He becomes the standard by which justice is imagined, not because he solves the problem, but because he contains it. Robin exists within this system as an extension rather than an individual. The role is presented as apprenticeship, but functionally it operates as displacement. Youth is folded into the myth to soften its edges, to suggest continuity and hope. The costume reassures the audience that the war on crime is not consuming the future. Yet this reassurance is symbolic, not protective. The city applauds the image while ignoring the exposure beneath it. Jason Todd enters this world not as a chosen hero, but as an intrusion. He is not shaped by legacy or ceremony. He arrives from the margins, from streets that do not produce icons, only survivors. His origin is not romanticized tragedy, but sustained neglect. Hunger is his first teacher. Distrust is his first language. He learns early that systems do not fail accidentally. They fail selectively. In Gotham, survival without structure breeds a different moral gravity. Jason does not grow toward abstraction. He grows toward immediacy. Right and wrong are measured in consequences, not intentions. Authority is something that watches, judges, and disappears. When Batman encounters him, the meeting is framed as rescue, but it is also recruitment. The system recognizes raw material. It does not pause to ask what it costs to refine it. The costume fits Jason differently. It does not elevate him. It compresses him. He carries into the role a volatility that does not dissolve under discipline. Instead, it sharpens. Gotham interprets this intensity as promise. A tougher Robin. A more aggressive response. The audience reads progress. The system reads utility. No one reads warning. What remains invisible is the incompatibility at the center of this arrangement. Batman's justice is built on containment. Jason's psychology is built on exposure. Batman absorbs violence to prevent escalation. Jason experiences violence as proof that escalation is already here. These two logics cannot coexist indefinitely. They occupy the same space, but respond to gravity in opposite ways. The city does not notice this divergence because it has learned to ignore internal fracture as long as the external performance holds. The spotlight stays fixed on the silhouette on the rooftop, not on the child standing beside it. The audience believes in succession, in mentorship, in the idea that symbols reproduce themselves intact. Gotham survives by believing that continuity is natural. Yet pressure accumulates where belief replaces inspection. Every patrol tightens the divide. Every rule enforced without explanation deepens the sense that justice here is conditional. Jason does not question the mission. He questions the cost. Not abstractly, personally. He notices who gets left behind. He notices how often restraint protects those who exploit it. He notices how easily pain becomes procedural. The system interprets his questions as immaturity, as impatience, as something that time will correct. But time does not soften pressure. It redistributes it, and in Gotham, pressure always moves downward. There is a cruelty embedded in how the city narrates its heroes. Failure is individualized. Collapse is personalized. Structural responsibility dissolves into character flaw. When something breaks, Gotham searches for a face to assign blame, never a framework to interrogate. This is how it maintains moral cleanliness. This is how it survives. Jason's presence destabilizes this arrangement not because he defies the rules, but because he exposes their selective application. He is too visible to remain a background casualty, yet too inconvenient to be fully protected. He occupies a threshold the system does not know how to manage. Not quite symbol, not quite expendable. A child standing in a war that insists it has already accounted for children. The tragedy has not yet occurred, but it is already organized. The conditions are in place. The roles are defined. Gotham has prepared its narrative in advance. The system will preserve itself. The symbol will endure. And the cost will be framed as necessary. This is not a story about a death that shocks the city. It is about a failure that never registered as failure at all. A justice that functioned exactly as designed. Jason Todd does not emerge from myth. He emerges from absence. Where Gotham's heroic lineage is typically framed through inheritance, mentorship, and symbolic continuity, Jason's entry point is deprivation. His childhood is defined less by a singular traumatic rupture and more by sustained erosion. Addiction, abandonment, instability, and the constant negotiation with danger are not events in his life. They are the environment itself. This distinction matters because it shapes how he understands power, authority, and survival long before a costume enters the picture. In Gotham's symbolic economy, suffering is usually converted into motivation. Loss becomes origin, pain becomes purpose, but Jason's suffering resists conversion. It does not clarify his identity. It fragments it. His relationship with the world is not organized around a future ideal, but around present necessity. He learns to read threats quickly, to respond decisively, to distrust systems that promise protection without delivering it. This produces a psychology oriented toward immediacy, where moral judgment is inseparable from consequence. Batman's psychology operates on a different axis entirely. His trauma is monumental, but it is also stabilized. It has been ritualized, structured, and disciplined into a code that prioritizes control above all else. Where Jason experiences loss as ongoing exposure, Batman experiences loss as a fixed point around which order can be built. His response to trauma is architectural. He constructs rules, boundaries, and prohibitions that transform pain into structure. This is how he avoids collapse. This is how he remains functional. The partnership that follows is often narrated as salvation, but structurally it resembles containment. Batman does not enter Jason's world so much as extract him from it and place him within an existing framework. The logic is consistent with Gotham's broader moral architecture. Disorder is addressed by relocation rather than repair. Jason is removed from the streets, given purpose, and folded into a myth that promises direction. What is not addressed is the internal logic Jason has already developed to survive those streets. Robin as a role is not neutral. It carries expectations shaped by prior occupants. It is meant to symbolize balance, optimism, and moral clarity. Jason inherits not just the costume, but the unresolved projections attached to it. He is expected to represent continuity, not disruption. Hope, not volatility. But his internal orientation resists this symbolic smoothing. The anger he carries is not performative. It is not a phase. It is a response to lived reality. This is where the foundational tension begins to crystallize. Batman's justice is procedural. It is governed by restraint, by the belief that crossing certain lines would collapse the entire structure. Jason's justice is experiential. It is governed by memory, by the awareness that restraint often functions as permission for further harm. These are not opposing opinions. They are incompatible worldviews formed under different gravitational conditions. Batman believes in systems because he has the resources to enforce them. He has mobility, technology, and narrative authority. Jason believes in intervention because he has seen what happens when systems hesitate. His moral compass is calibrated through proximity to victims, not distance from perpetrators. He does not see criminals as abstractions to be managed. He sees them as forces that persist because nothing decisively stops them. The mentorship dynamic masks this incompatibility by framing it as developmental. Jason's aggression is interpreted as immaturity. His defiance is framed as something that discipline will correct. But this interpretation is itself a projection. It assumes that Batman's psychological architecture represents maturity rather than adaptation. It treats restraint as moral superiority rather than a specific survival strategy forged under specific conditions. The Joker enters this field not merely as antagonist, but as amplifier. He is the purest expression of Gotham's moral paradox. He operates without investment in outcome, exposing the limits of any system that relies on predictability. For Batman, the Joker represents the ultimate test of restraint. For Jason, he represents the cost of that restraint made visible. Every encounter reinforces their divergence. What Batman interprets as proof of moral resolve, Jason experiences as repeated failure to protect the vulnerable. This divergence is not accidental. It is structurally necessary. Gotham requires figures like Batman to stabilize its identity. It also produces figures like Jason who absorb the residue of that stabilization. The city's moral clarity is purchased through displacement. Pain that cannot be integrated into the symbol is pushed outward, where it accumulates in individuals who do not fit cleanly into the narrative. Jason's increasing volatility is not a descent. It is a revelation. The more he participates in the system, the clearer its contradictions become. He sees how often justice arrives too late. He notices how easily criminals exploit procedural mercy. He experiences firsthand the asymmetry between those who can afford restraint and those who pay its price. His frustration is not a rejection of morality, but a confrontation with its selective application. Batman, for his part, is not blind to Jason's struggle, but his response is constrained by his own architecture. To acknowledge the validity of Jason's position would require re-examining the foundation of his code. It would mean admitting that restraint is not universally virtuous, that it may function as moral insulation rather than protection. This admission threatens collapse. So the system responds defensively. Warnings replace dialogue. Control replaces understanding. Distance replaces engagement. The partnership becomes strained not because of a single disagreement, but because the symbolic roles they inhabit no longer align with the psychological realities they embody. Jason is no longer simply a sidekick. He is a pressure point. By the time the narrative approaches its breaking moment, the outcome is already encoded. The system has identified Jason as unstable. The symbol has begun to detach from the individual. Responsibility is subtly redistributed. Risk becomes acceptable. The city continues to believe in the myth, even as it positions one of its children closer to the edge. This is the foundation upon which the conflict will crystallize. Not a sudden betrayal, but a gradual narrowing of moral vision. Not a failure of intention, but a failure of structure. Gotham has already decided what it will protect. The rest is only a matter of sequence. The conflict does not announce itself with spectacle. It advances through routine. Night after night, patrol after patrol, the same patterns repeat with minor variations. Gotham's streets become a laboratory where theory is tested against reality, and Jason is placed at the center of the experiment. The rules are clear. Apprehend, restrain, deliver, withdraw. What remains unresolved is whether this sequence produces safety or merely postpones harm. For Batman, repetition reinforces faith in the system. For Jason, repetition exposes its limits. Jason's encounters grow harsher not because crime escalates, but because his perception sharpens. He begins to notice cycles rather than incidents. The same offenders returning. The same neighborhoods absorbing the damage. The same victims disappearing from the narrative once the spotlight moves on. Gotham presents crime as disruption, but Jason experiences it as continuity. Violence here is not an interruption of order. It is part of its maintenance. Each decision Jason makes under pressure reveals the divergence between symbolic justice and lived consequence. When he hesitates, people get hurt. When he intervenes decisively, he is reprimanded. The message is subtle but consistent. Effectiveness is secondary to optics. Containment matters more than outcome. Jason learns that what is punished is not failure, but deviation from the script. Batman's authority intensifies in response. Rules are reiterated, boundaries reinforced. The partnership begins to resemble surveillance rather than mentorship. Jason's actions are monitored not for their impact, but for their compliance. This shift is not framed as mistrust, but as concern. Yet concern functions here as control. It signals that Jason is no longer seen as an extension of the symbol, but as a variable that must be managed. The Joker's presence escalates this tension by introducing unpredictability into an already strained system. He does not operate to win or dominate. He operates to expose. Every crime is structured as a question Gotham cannot answer cleanly. Why protect those who will harm again? Why preserve lives that exist solely to dismantle others? Why maintain rules that benefit those who exploit them most efficiently? Batman responds by tightening his grip on restraint. Jason responds by questioning the purpose of restraint itself. These encounters do not radicalize Jason. They clarify him. His anger is not impulsive. It is cumulative. Each failure adds weight. Each compromise increases pressure. He is not seeking permission to be violent. He is seeking acknowledgement that violence already exists and is being selectively ignored. His worldview begins to organize around a simple observation. The system protects itself first. Justice is secondary. The breaking point is approached gradually, through isolation rather than confrontation. Batman does not expel Jason. He distances him. Missions change. Trust narrows. Jason senses the shift, but is not given language for it. He is treated as a liability without being addressed as a subject. The system withdraws relational investment while maintaining authority. This is how institutions disengage without admitting failure. When Jason pursues the Joker alone, the decision is framed as recklessness. In reality, it is coherence. He is acting in alignment with his internal logic rather than the imposed narrative. He believes intervention must be decisive because delay has proven lethal. He believes accountability must be final because repetition has proven merciless. This belief does not arise from moral collapse. It arises from pattern recognition. The ambush is not simply a villain's triumph. It is the moment where systemic assumptions collide with reality. Jason is captured not because he is careless, but because he is operating within a framework that underestimates how disposable he has become. The system assumed protection without guaranteeing it. It assumed authority without proximity. When the Joker isolates Jason, the city does not feel the rupture immediately. The spotlight remains elsewhere. The violence inflicted on Jason is not symbolic. It is excessive, personal, and deliberate. The Joker does not seek information. He seeks demonstration. The beating is a performance staged for an absent audience, a proof that the rules Batman lives by have no jurisdiction here. Jason is not punished for crossing a line. He is punished for believing anyone would stop it. Death arrives not as a climax, but as an administrative outcome. A body counted, a failure logged. Gotham processes the loss efficiently. Batman internalizes it as personal guilt, but the structure remains intact. The rule stands. The symbol survives. Jason is reframed as a lesson rather than a responsibility. This is the moment where the child justice failed is fully revealed. Not because the system lacked awareness, but because it functioned as intended. Risk was managed. Symbols were preserved. Consequences were individualized. The city mourns briefly, then moves on. The narrative closes the chapter, but something has shifted beneath the surface. The system has absorbed a fracture it cannot metabolize. Jason's death does not resolve tension. It compresses it. Pressure that should have forced transformation is buried instead. Gotham believes the story is over. It is not. Death does not conclude Jason Todd's story. It dislocates it. What should have functioned as an endpoint instead becomes a reservoir. Gotham seals the event within memory, treating it as tragedy already processed, but unresolved pressure does not vanish. It migrates. Jason's absence becomes an unspoken presence, shaping decisions without being acknowledged, influencing the system from below rather than within it. Batman absorbs the loss by intensifying control. Guilt does not soften his code. It hardens it. The response is inward contraction rather than outward revision. He reinforces the same prohibitions that failed to protect Jason, interpreting the outcome as evidence that deviation is dangerous, not that the framework is insufficient. This is how systems defend themselves after catastrophe. They confuse preservation with correctness. The city mirrors this response. Mourning is ritualized, brief, and symbolic. A name added to a list. A memory folded into myth. Jason becomes a cautionary tale, stripped of complexity and reconfigured as a warning about recklessness. The narrative absolves the structure by isolating the failure within the individual. Gotham moves forward without examining what it demanded of a child in the first place. What remains unspoken is the asymmetry of responsibility. Jason was given authority without sovereignty, power without authorship. He was expected to enforce rules he did not create, under conditions he did not choose, while bearing consequences he could not redistribute. His death exposes the imbalance between symbolic participation and actual agency, but the exposure is quickly buried beneath continuity. Resurrection, when it comes, does not function as rebirth. It is disruption without integration. Jason returns not to a system prepared to receive him, but to one that has already replaced him. The symbol has moved on. The role persists without the individual. This is critical. Jason's return is not a reclaiming of identity, but a confrontation with disposability. The experience of death and return reorganizes Jason's psychology around clarity rather than confusion. He no longer seeks recognition from the system that abandoned him. He no longer believes in reforming structures that require sacrifice to sustain themselves. What emerges is not madness, but coherence sharpened by betrayal. The anger that once struggled for articulation now finds form. Red Hood is not a costume change. It is a positional shift. Jason abandons the periphery and claims territory. He stops operating within Gotham's moral architecture and begins to contest it directly. Where Batman polices from above, Jason embeds himself within the machinery of crime. Where Batman seeks to contain, Jason seeks to interrupt. His methods are not chaotic. They are strategic. This is where the conflict enters full polarization. Jason's actions are framed as corruption because they violate the city's preferred optics. He kills. He coerces. He dismantles networks rather than processing individuals. Gotham recoils not because violence has increased, but because its management has changed. Violence is no longer being absorbed quietly by marginalized bodies. It is being redistributed upward. Batman interprets this as moral collapse. He frames Jason's return as proof that crossing the line destroys the self. But this interpretation avoids a more dangerous question: whether the self was already being destroyed by compliance. Jason's violence is explicit, but Batman's restraint has always been violent in its consequences. The difference lies in visibility. Their confrontations are not debates. They are collisions between incompatible moral economies. Batman operates under the belief that justice must remain unsullied to retain legitimacy. Jason operates under the belief that legitimacy without protection is empty. Each sees the other as a threat not just to order, but to meaning itself. Jason forces Batman into proximity with outcomes he has long deferred. Bodies that do not return to crime statistics. Criminal hierarchies disrupted rather than recycled. Victims spared not by intervention, but by prevention. These outcomes complicate Batman's narrative. They introduce ambiguity into a system built on moral clarity. Yet Batman cannot integrate this ambiguity without dismantling the foundation of his identity. To accept Jason's logic would be to admit that restraint has functioned as self-preservation rather than universal good. It would mean recognizing that his code protected him as much as it protected Gotham. This realization threatens collapse. So the conflict hardens. Jason, in turn, no longer seeks approval. His objective is not reconciliation, but exposure. He embodies the cost of the system made visible. A child trained for war, discarded when inconvenient, resurrected without reintegration. He becomes a walking indictment, a reminder that justice in Gotham has always required sacrificial figures to sustain its image. The city responds by polarizing its audience. Jason is labeled monster or martyr, depending on where one stands. Tribal lines form. The narrative fractures. This is not chaos. It is reorganization. Gotham's moral consensus begins to erode as competing interpretations gain traction. The system that once absorbed conflict through myth now finds itself contested by counter-myth. Jason is no longer a failure to be forgotten. He is a problem that refuses to stay buried. The pressure that was once displaced has returned, heavier and more articulate. The conflict has moved beyond personal grievance. It has become structural, and the city can no longer pretend otherwise. The final stage of the conflict does not unfold as escalation, but as stabilization around opposing truths. By this point, the lines are no longer shifting. They are solidifying. Gotham has adjusted to Jason's presence not by resolving the contradiction he embodies, but by incorporating it as a permanent disturbance. The system learns to live with fracture as long as it can still define itself against it. Jason's operations evolve from reaction into structure. He is no longer responding to Batman. He is building an alternative logic of control. His use of lethal force is not indiscriminate. It follows an internal hierarchy shaped by lived consequence. He targets organizers, brokers, figures who profit from repetition. His violence is not expressive. It is instrumental. Each action is meant to compress cycles rather than extend them. This distinction matters because it reveals the depth of the polarization. Batman's justice relies on the belief that restraint preserves the moral center of the city. Jason's justice assumes the center has already collapsed, and that stability must be rebuilt from the margins inward. One defends an existing architecture. The other constructs pressure points until the architecture responds or breaks. Their encounters become less frequent, but more definitive. Each confrontation functions as a referendum on Gotham's values rather than a tactical dispute. Batman speaks in absolutes because his identity requires them. Jason speaks in outcomes because abstraction failed him long ago. The conversation never resolves because it is not meant to. It exists to expose incompatibility, not to reconcile it. The city watches these clashes with growing unease. The familiar binary of hero and villain no longer holds. Jason cannot be dismissed as chaos because his actions produce measurable effects. Batman cannot be celebrated uncritically because his methods now appear insufficient against certain forms of harm. Gotham's audience is forced into interpretation rather than consumption. This shift destabilizes the city's moral economy. What emerges is a redistribution of symbolic gravity. Batman remains the dominant figure, but his shadow lengthens in unexpected directions. Jason occupies that shadow deliberately. He does not seek to replace Batman. He seeks to redefine what the shadow reveals. By operating where Batman refuses to go, he exposes the selective blindness embedded in restraint. He makes visible what was once absorbed quietly. This visibility generates discomfort because it implicates more than individual characters. It implicates the audience. The question is no longer whether Jason is right or wrong. It is whether the system that created him can deny responsibility for his conclusions. Gotham's institutions, fictional and cultural, prefer clean distinctions. Jason refuses cleanliness. He carries residue. Batman's refusal to kill remains intact, but it now reads differently. What once signified moral clarity begins to resemble rigidity. His code no longer appears as an unchallenged foundation, but as a personal necessity elevated to universal law. Jason's existence reframes Batman's restraint as choice rather than inevitability, and choice invites evaluation. The conflict reaches a point where further escalation would be redundant. Both positions have declared themselves fully. Jason does not need to kill Batman to make his point. Batman does not need to defeat Jason to preserve his symbol. The struggle persists not through action, but through coexistence. Two moral systems occupying the same territory, neither able to absorb the other. This coexistence is unstable but enduring. Gotham becomes a divided arena where justice is no longer singular. Citizens, criminals, and observers are forced to navigate competing interpretations of safety, accountability, and legitimacy. The city does not collapse under this strain. It adapts. Fracture becomes a feature rather than a flaw. Jason's role crystallizes here. He is no longer simply the child who was failed. He is the memory of that failure given agency. His continued presence ensures that the system cannot return to innocence. Every time Batman enforces restraint, Jason's shadow reminds the city of its cost. Every time Jason enacts finality, Batman's presence reminds the city of what is being surrendered. This is the point of no return. Not because violence peaks, but because ambiguity becomes permanent. Gotham has crossed from myth into contested meaning. The conflict no longer seeks resolution because resolution would require erasure. And neither side can be erased without collapsing the entire structure that produced them. The child justice failed does not remain a victim. He becomes a boundary, a living measure of what the system is willing to accept and what it is willing to lose. Jason Todd's conflict does not remain contained within Gotham's narrative borders. It bleeds outward into the way the story is received, debated, and metabolized by its audience. What begins as a character fracture becomes a cultural fault line. Jason's existence forces a reevaluation of what justice stories are meant to do and whom they are designed to protect. The discomfort he generates is not incidental. It is structural. For decades, superhero mythology trained audiences to accept restraint as moral maturity. The refusal to kill functioned as shorthand for ethical superiority, a guarantee that power would not corrupt absolutely. Jason destabilizes this shorthand by embodying the cost that restraint displaces. His story makes visible the bodies that accumulate beneath moral purity, the lives absorbed quietly so the symbol can remain intact. This is why reactions to him polarize so intensely. He does not simply challenge Batman. He challenges the audience's moral self-image. Culturally, Jason represents the return of the repressed within heroic myth. He carries everything the genre historically pushed aside to maintain coherence. Rage that cannot be sublimated, trauma that does not resolve into purpose, anger that refuses redemption arcs. In doing so, he transforms the superhero narrative from a story about order into a story about cost. This shift unsettles because it removes the comfort of distance. The violence is no longer abstract. It is ethical. The figure of the sidekick had long functioned as symbolic insurance. Youth beside the hero reassured the audience that the war being fought would not consume the future. Jason breaks this illusion retroactively. His death reframes every prior appearance of youthful heroism as exposure rather than hope. The cultural memory of Robin is altered. Innocence is no longer protected by proximity to virtue. It is endangered by it. Jason's return intensifies this reevaluation. Resurrection in comic mythology usually restores equilibrium. Here, it does the opposite. It refuses closure. Jason returns not healed, not grateful, not aligned. He returns with memory intact and loyalty severed. This disrupts the genre's usual promise that death is temporary and therefore narratively safe. Jason makes death consequential again by carrying its psychological residue forward. The Red Hood persona operates as counter-myth. Where Batman embodies containment, Jason embodies leakage. He exposes what escapes when systems prioritize image over outcome. His methods are deliberately legible. He does not hide behind ambiguity. He forces the audience to confront the uncomfortable possibility that effectiveness and morality are not always aligned, and that refusing to choose is itself a choice with consequences. This dynamic resonates beyond Gotham because it mirrors broader cultural tensions around authority, accountability, and institutional trust. Jason emerges during periods where audiences are increasingly skeptical of systems that promise safety while producing harm. His appeal is not rooted in nihilism. but in disillusionment. He articulates a frustration many recognize but struggle to name. The sense that rules protect those who understand how to exploit them, while punishing those who act in good faith. Batman's continued dominance within the narrative ensures that this tension never resolves into replacement. Jason does not overthrow the symbol. He contaminates it. This contamination is crucial. It prevents the myth from stabilizing into dogma. Batman remains aspirational, but no longer unquestionable. Jason ensures that the myth must now coexist with its shadow, rather than deny it. Audience identification splits accordingly. Some align with Batman's restraint as the last defense against moral collapse. Others align with Jason's decisiveness as the only language power understands. This division is not about preference. It is about lived experience. Those who have benefited from procedural justice gravitate toward Batman. Those who have been harmed by its delays gravitate toward Jason. The narrative becomes a mirror rather than an escape. In this way, Jason functions as a cultural irritant. He prevents complacency. He disrupts consumption by demanding interpretation. Stories featuring him cannot be absorbed passively because they refuse to resolve into comfort. Every appearance reopens the question of what justice actually does, rather than what it claims to be. The symbolic weight of Jason Todd lies in his refusal to disappear. The system tried to erase him through death. It tried to neutralize him through framing. It failed. His persistence transforms him into a cultural memory that cannot be sanitized. He is the reminder that heroic myths are not immune to ethical debt, and that debts ignored do not vanish. They accrue interest. This is why Jason endures, not as an anti-hero fad, but as a structural challenge embedded within the genre. He ensures that Gotham, and the audience watching it, can never again pretend that justice is clean, painless, or evenly distributed. Jason Todd's legacy does not settle into resolution. It settles into pressure. What remains after the conflict has stabilized is not clarity in the conventional sense, but a permanent alteration of the moral landscape. Gotham continues to function. Crime persists. The symbol endures. Yet something fundamental has shifted in how justice is perceived, narrated, and absorbed. The city can no longer claim innocence through ritual alone. Jason's continued presence operates as a living archive. He carries the memory the system attempted to compress into tragedy and move past. Every action he takes reactivates that memory, forcing the city to confront not what happened to him, but why it was allowed to happen. His existence interrupts the fantasy that failure can be contained within isolated events. It exposes failure as cumulative, structural, and ongoing. Batman's legacy is altered in parallel. He remains the axis around which Gotham's identity turns, but the purity of that axis is compromised. His refusal to kill no longer reads as an uncontested moral high ground. It reads as a personal vow elevated into universal law. This distinction matters because it introduces subjectivity into what was once treated as absolute. The symbol still commands loyalty, but that loyalty now carries tension. The relationship between Batman and Jason does not evolve toward reconciliation. It evolves toward mutual recognition without acceptance. Each understands the internal coherence of the other's position. Neither can inhabit it. This mutual clarity replaces the earlier framework of mentorship and rebellion. What remains is an unresolved standoff between two survival strategies, shaped by different exposures to harm. Gotham absorbs this standoff by normalizing contradiction. The city becomes an arena where multiple moral logics operate simultaneously. Law enforcement, vigilantes, criminals, and civilians adjust to a world where justice is no longer singular. This pluralization does not produce harmony. It produces vigilance. Every action must now be interpreted rather than assumed. Jason's legacy within this environment is not dominance, but permanence. He ensures that the system cannot fully revert to its prior state. Even when he recedes from the foreground, his logic persists as an undercurrent. Criminals adapt their behavior in response to him. Allies question the sufficiency of restraint. The audience carries forward the discomfort his story introduced. The fracture remains active. Importantly, Jason is not transformed into a savior figure. His methods remain ethically fraught. His violence leaves residue. His certainty produces collateral damage. The narrative resists converting him into a new ideal. This resistance is essential. Jason's function is not to replace one myth with another, but to prevent myth from hardening into insulation. He is the reminder that every system produces excess it cannot justify. The child justice failed becomes an adult justice cannot fully absorb. This transformation is not empowerment in the celebratory sense. It is crystallization. Jason becomes a boundary condition, a figure who defines the limits of what the system can tolerate without changing. His survival ensures that those limits remain visible. The broader cultural legacy follows the same pattern. Jason's story persists because it articulates a question that does not age out of relevance. What happens when moral restraint protects structures more reliably than people? What happens when systems require sacrifice but refuse accountability? What happens when those sacrifices return with memory intact? These questions do not resolve with time. They resurface whenever authority is questioned, whenever institutions claim virtue while producing harm, whenever individuals raised within a system recognize its contradictions too clearly to remain compliant. Jason functions as a modern myth precisely because he does not offer transcendence. He offers confrontation. Gotham's mythology becomes heavier as a result. The stories gain density. Victory is no longer clean. Failure is no longer singular. The audience is no longer allowed to consume justice as spectacle without consequence. This is the lasting transformation Jason enacts. Not through domination, but through contamination of the narrative with reality. In the end, Jason Todd does not stand as proof that justice is impossible. He stands as proof that justice, when abstracted from consequence, becomes self-protecting rather than protective. His life, death, and return map the cost of that abstraction across time. The system continues. The city endures. The conflict remains active. This is the legacy. Not closure, but awareness that cannot be undone. Not reconciliation, but a permanent mark on the moral architecture of the story. Jason Todd remains where the system broke, ensuring that the break is never forgotten.